So next we're going to cover Chapter 9, the nervous system. So the nervous system is divided into a few different sections. The main thing that you need to know is that there's the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system, which can be divided up even further. An example of one of those further divisions is the autonomic nervous system. So here you can see that the central nervous system has the brain and the spinal cord, which do carry messages from one to the other, and then they both take messages around to the to other peripheral nerves in the body, because the brain can send out messages to your cranial nerves or to your spinal cord to send out to other parts of the body. So this would be things like the autonomic, which is the involuntary motor neurons, or the somatic, which are the voluntary motor neurons. And then there are your sensory nerves, which are going to carry messages back to your brain through your spinal cord so that they can be interpreted there. So your neurons themselves consist of three different parts. There's the cell body of the neuron, which is the main part, the dendrites, which are these little branching projections that conduct the impulses to the cell body of the neuron, and then the axon, which is one single elongated projection, which is used to carry messages away from the body of the neuron. Which you can see here, there's the cell body, the little dendrites poking out, and then your axon, which is used to carry messages away from the cell body into their next destination. Now, as you can see here, this axon is also covered in a myelin sheath, and that's used to protect it and kind of keep carrying the message along the right path with minimal interruptions. So neurons are normally classified according to their function or the direction of the impulse, which way it's being carried. Your sensory neurons are the ones that can conduct the impulse to the spinal cord. So it's carrying the message from your nerves kind of around in your body that's picking up the sensation and bringing it to your spinal cord and then to the brain so that it can be interpreted. These are also called afferent neurons. And then you have your motor neurons. Your motor neurons are used to carry messages away from the brain through your spinal cord and out to your muscles or glands to create whatever reaction the body is having to whatever sensory information it gained. These are called efferent neurons. And then you also have interneurons. Interneurons connect the impulses from your sensory neurons to your motor neurons. These are also called central or connecting neurons. And that's just to carry the message back and forth. So your nerves themselves, well, nerves are just a bundle of those peripheral axons, and they go along a track, which is a bundle of the central axons. And so those are in the central nervous system. Then you have white matter. White matter is brain or spinal cord tissue that's composed mainly of myelinated axons. So if you remember that picture that we saw of the axon, it had kind of those little bubble coatings on it. So that makes up the white matter. Gray matter is your brain or spinal cord tissue. It is composed primarily of cell bodies, so those big things on the end, or unmyelinated fibers. And that looks kind of a gray or darker color if you were to look at it on a CT scan or a film or something. So we're just going to touch briefly on reflexes. Reflexes are a nerve impulse that is conducted from a receptor to an effector. So it's taking in your sensory information and carrying it right over to your motor neurons through a little interneuron connector. Instead of going up all the way to your brain so your brain can decide what to do, it kind of creates its own reaction, and that's what a reflex is. And that's why it happens so fast, because it didn't have to go to your brain and have your brain tell you what to do about it. So here's an example. So when you go to the doctor and he tests the reflexes in your knee, he hits your patellar tendon with the little hammer. And what happens there is that it causes this stretch receptor in your muscle to pick up the sense that that's being stretched. And then what happens is it's going to send that information up to your spinal cord, and instead of going to your brain because it knows that that's being stretched, this interneuron is then going down to your muscle fibers or connecting to your motor neuron to tell this muscle to contract. It's telling it to contract to relieve some of the stretch. So nerve impulses. Nerve impulses work because they're a self-propagating wave. So basically what happens is once it gets triggered on one end of your neuron or from your cell body, it actually keeps continuing traveling along that pathway of the axon by an electrical disturbance that happens. This is called the action potential. So it kind of waves that electrical activity down the length of the axon, and that's how your impulse gets from one end of the axon to the other. So another thing that's good to know about is your synapse. The synapse is the place where impulses are transmitted from one neuron to the other. And they're made of three different structures. You have your synaptic knob, the synaptic cleft, and then the plasma membrane. So the synaptic knob is the end of whatever the current neuron, active neuron is. That's going to carry something over to the plasma membrane, which is on like the next neuron or whatever the structure is that it's acting on. The synaptic cleft is the space in between the two. So your neurotransmitters are actually released by the synaptic knob, and they bind with specific receptors on the membrane of the next cell. And what happens is when they bind there, they actually open up these ion channels, kind of like opening up a door so that the message can then go into the next cell or nerve or whatever the acting structure is. And that's how the message is carried on to another neuron or another cell, is through those little synapses. So here's the picture. You can see where this is a synaptic knob. Right here, the space in between is the cleft. Then this is the plasma membrane of whatever the next structure is. These here are your ion channels. And so whenever one of these little neurotransmitters, they get to the end of your synaptic cleft or your synapse, and they open up into the synaptic cleft, and they can actually go in through these little channels, and if they fit, if they're the right one, they open it up, so then they create this opening so that then whatever this message is can get carried in and carry the message along the next cell. So for a disorder that disrupts this, we have Parkinson's disease as a great example. Parkinson's disease is a abnormally low level of the neurotransmitter dopamine in their motor control areas of the patients. So these patients normally exhibit involuntary trembling or muscle rigidity, and that's because dopamine is used in your muscle relaxation controls. So it's kind of like these or relaxation and tension parts. And so that's telling your body to tense and relax normally, those neurotransmitters, and now they're not working correctly, which is where you get all that involuntary muscle rigidity and movement because there are such low levels of dopamine. And that's what Parkinson's disease is. So here you can see this is just an example of Parkinson's disease. So normally they're tilted forward, they have some rigid movement, and they're trembling. Normally their arms are very stiff at their sides, and they don't move normally. Their gait's very shuffly in short steps because they just don't move their legs right. Their muscles are very stiff and rigid. So for some other disorders of nervous tissue, you can have multiple sclerosis. That's characterized by the myelin loss over the central fibers, resulting in a conduction impairment. Because normally, remember how that conduction just travels along your axon, and those myelin sheaths kind of protect it. So without those, it sort of exposes that axon to other impulses that can come and start disturbing things in your nerve fibers. And then you can also have a tumor. And normally those are called a neuroma, or any tumor that happens in the nervous system is called a neuroma. So this is an example of multiple sclerosis because you can see where this parts of the axon have been demyelinated. So these are your myelin sheaths, and this is what it should normally look like. So yeah, there are these areas where there's exposed axon where there's not supposed to be. So just to go back to a little bit of the anatomy again, we have some divisions of the brain. So first you have your brainstem. Your brainstem consists of 3 parts. It's named in ascending order is your medulla oblongata, your pons, and then your midbrain. And these are mainly white matter. So remember that's the myelinated stuff with a few little bits of gray matter in it. And your brainstem, its main function is really it's to be a two-way conduction system because all the senses have to pass through there. So everything that your body's taking in as sensory information has to go through there, and then everything it's sending out as motor impulses has to go through there. So it conducts those impulses to the higher parts of the brain, and then the higher parts of the brain have to go through there. Another really super important function of it is that most of your really important kind of normal body reflexes lie in your brainstem. And that's kind of like your survival instincts exist in your brainstem. So that's like your reflex to keep breathing and the reflex for your heart to keep beating. Those are all located in your brainstem. And then your higher functioning, more of your thought processes, those are all in the higher parts of your brain. So one of the higher parts of your brain would be your hypothalamus, and that consists of your posterior pituitary gland, the pituitary stalk, and it has a lot of gray matter in it. And this acts as the major center for controlling your autonomic nervous system. So those are those involuntary functions that you have, and it helps control most of them. It also controls hormone secretions by the anterior and posterior pituitary glands. So it helps to control most of the endocrine system glands. It also contains the centers that control your appetite and wakefulness, restfulness, and pleasure, that kind of stuff. So then your thalamus is a dumbbell-shaped mass of gray matter which extends into each cerebral hemisphere. And what this main function is that it's going to relay sensory impulses to your cerebral cortex and those sensory areas. So in some way, it produces the emotions of like pleasant or unpleasant that are associated with things. So your thalamus kind of tells you like, I like this, it's pleasurable. I don't like this, it's not pleasurable. And you have your cerebellum. And this is the largest part of the human brain. So this helps control muscle contractions to produce coordination and movements that we have. It's also going to help because it controls those muscle contractions, remember, with balance and moving smoothly and being able to maintain your posture. Your cerebellum is really responsible for all of that. And there's been some more evidence lately that says that your cerebellum may be more extensive, and that it'll actually assist the cerebrum and other regions of the brain as well as just being in control of muscle function. So your cerebrum, this is the largest part of the human brain, and this is kind of what people think of when they think of the brain. This is what they see in their head. The outer membrane layer of gray matter is your cerebral cortex, and that's made up of the lobes, those 2 lobes that people think of when they think of the human brain. And that's composed mainly of dendrites and cell bodies, because remember, gray matter is the unmyelinated part. So dendrites and cell bodies are unmyelinated. It's the axon that's that white matter and myelinated. So the interior part of your cerebrum is composed mainly of the white matter. And remember, those are the ones that are myelinated, and because it's part of your central nervous system, those bundles are called tracts. And the function of this is a lot of your mental processing. So these are interpreting sensations and your consciousness and memory and all of your voluntary control of movements and that kind of stuff. So here we can just see a picture. So you can see it's your cerebellum here on the outside. And then this is right here is your thalamus. It's your midbrain, your pons, your medulla, your spinal cord, and that's your cerebellum right there in the back. So like I said, your cerebrum, that's what people tend to think of when they think of the human brain. They kind of forget that all of this stuff is still part of the brain, and they just picture this part here on the outside. So for some brain disorders, there can be some destruction of brain tissue. That can be caused by something like a CVA, a cerebrovascular accident. So that's normally caused by a hemorrhage or a sensation of blood flow to your brain. It's also called a stroke. And that's because if it's a hemorrhage, it means that one of the blood vessels in your brain kind of burst open, ruptured, and now you're bleeding into your brain, which means that now it's creating a lot of pressure in your brain, as well as wherever that blood vessel was supposed to be delivering blood to is now not getting blood. Or the sensation or cessation of blood flow, which means that now there's a blockage of that artery, which means a part of your brain is no longer getting blood flow. And so what happens if you're not getting blood flow, you're not getting oxygen, you're not getting nutrients, so it's basically starving your brain to death. Or if you're hemorrhaging, it's creating a ton of pressure and kind of squeezing your brain and squeezing all those other blood vessels that are supposed to be there. So it's really just putting pressure on your brain, and it's starving your brain at the same time. And if it's not fixed fast enough, it can actually cause permanent damage and kill some of your brain cells. And that's why strokes can really be very, very detrimental or very life-threatening or debilitating if you do happen to survive it. And then another example would be cerebral palsy. This is a condition in which there's damage to the motor control areas of the brain, and normally that happens during or shortly after birth, and it can cause paralysis. Normally it's a spastic paralysis, which means that their muscles are very spastic and tense, and they can't relax and can't really control them anymore. They're just spastic of one or more limbs. Normally it's either happens in both lower extremities or both upper extremities. For other brain disorders, there's also things like dementia. Dementia is a progressive loss of brain memory. Normally there's a shortened attention span, some personality changes. They have a reduced intellectual capacity and a lack of motor control. And dementia can kind of be classified into a few different types of dementia. There's Alzheimer's disease, which probably everybody's heard of, and that's a brain disorder of the mid to late adult years, and it's mainly characterized by dementia. There's also Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease is a disorder where there is dementia along with a couple of other things, and the main thing that it's characterized by is this purposeless movement that they get, or chorea. And that it starts out with a purposeless movement and then it just progresses to severe dementia and death. And normally that happens to people more in their mid-adult years. They don't normally live to see their later adult years. And then there's HIV, which causes AIDS, but that also affects your neurons and can cause dementia as well. So this is just a scan of somebody's brain. So you can see the normal functioning brain, and then here you can see Alzheimer's and how much brain matter has actually been lost. So their brain's much smaller after Alzheimer's has affected them. So another nervous system disorder, brain disorder, are seizures. Seizures are this sudden burst of abnormal neuron activity that results in some temporary brain functions. So your body is not only kind of not under control, but it doesn't even necessarily function the way that it's supposed to because your brain isn't functioning normally, so it's not sending out those messages that it's supposed to. Epilepsy. There are many different forms of it, but basically it's characterized by reoccurring seizures. It's not just a one-time thing, they're reoccurring. And then we can have an EEG, which is how we measure the brain activity. And that's an electroencephalogram. But what that does is it actually measures the voltage changes in the brain to evaluate people's brain activities. And that will actually tell us if somebody's having seizures because there's kind of a specific voltage pattern that shows up when somebody's having seizures. So here you can see this is just somebody who's getting an EEG, and now it's actually hooked up to a computer. This is like the old school version where it used to trace it out on a piece of paper. But normally brain activity kind of looks a specific way, and then seizures kind of like this are a lot more jagged lines. There are people who are trained to read and interpret these, far more specialized than I, so that they can actually pick up when seizures are happening and where in the brain and all kinds of stuff like that. So now moving away from the brain, we'll talk a little bit about the spinal cord. So the spinal cord consists of columns of white matter. So remember, those are your myelinated nerve fibers. They form the outer portion of this kind of H-shaped core inside your spinal cord, inside your vertebral column. And remember that that's still part of your central nervous system. So those bundles of axons are called tracts. And the interior part of that is formed by gray matter, which remember is that unmyelinated stuff in the cell bodies. So your spinal cord is kind of a two-way conduction system, so it's going to take in that sensory information and then send out that motor information. So messages travel up and down your spinal cord. It's because it has to carry that message. It almost serves like a little train pathway. It has to carry the messages out from the body up to your brain for interpretation and then send whatever reaction needs to happen after back up to your body. So here we can see the pictures of it. So that's spreading out. You can see where all these little messages come off your spinal cord where your vertebrae are, and that's to send messages out to your body. And then here's a picture so that you can see where there's that little H-shaped section here of the gray matter. So you can see here the gray matter surrounded by some white matter. You can see these nerves kind of coming off of it. So for your peripheral nervous system, first you have some cranial nerves, and those are going to attach to the outer surface of the brain. And they connect the brain with the head and neck, and some structures in your thorax and even down to your abdomen. And then you have your spinal nerves, which there are 31 pairs of, and they contain the dendrites of the sensory nerves and the axons of the motor nerves. And those are used to conduct impulses for sensations and voluntary movements. And the skin area is actually supplied by a single nerve called a dermatome. So that's the only type of nerve that actually goes out to the skin. So here's just a picture of the brain. So you can see the brain kind of where the midbrain is, and some of these cranial nerves that are going down to different parts of the body. So you can see that some kind of go to your eye and your nose, different parts of your face, but some also go down to other parts of your body. Like your vagus nerve is normally one that's really common. This goes down to parts of your GI tract and your heart. And that one's kind of common because if you ever hear somebody say that they did the vagal maneuver, it's actually when you create the sensation like you're bearing down, like you're going to have a bowel movement. And if done with enough force, you can actually kind of squeeze that nerve. And because it's also connected to your heart, you can actually cause yourself to slow your heart rate down by it. People have actually done it to the point accidentally where they pass out, they lose consciousness. It's also a maneuver that sometimes they use in the hospital if somebody's heart rate is like spontaneously too fast or they're starting to go into a very rapid rhythm. Sometimes if you vagal, you can trigger that nerve to almost reset your heart rate at a slower one. So that's an interesting thing that the nervous system happens to do. And then this is a picture just of the different nerves in the body and where they actually go. So one of the things that's interesting is how high up they go and how high up they actually control. So you can see kind of where all of your nerves are here and where their sensations go in the body. So for some peripheral nerve disorders, you can have neuritis. That's a general term referring to nerve inflammation. One of the very common ones for this is sciatica, which is an inflammation of the sciatic nerve. And that starts in your lower back and actually goes down to your legs. So that causes a lot of leg pain for people. Or they can have neuralgia, which is a muscle pain. It's often accompanied by neuritis, which is, like we said, that general inflammation of a nerve. There's trigeminal neuralgia, and that's when there are reoccurring episodes of like a stabbing pain along one or more of the branches of the trigeminal, which is the fifth cranial nerve in the head, and there are stabbing pains along that. And then another peripheral nerve disorder is Bell palsy. Bell palsy is a paralysis of facial features, and that's normally because there's a damage of the facial or seventh cranial nerve. Bell's palsy tends to originally display itself with a lot of the same symptoms as a stroke, and that's what a lot of people think that they have at first. But the thing about Bell's palsy is that normally it just affects those facial nerves, and a lot of it actually tends to come back and be reversed over time, which is a good thing. And then another nerve disorder is actually herpes zoster, or shingles, which is a viral infection. It's actually caused by the chickenpox virus that has invaded one of the dorsal root ganglions and has actually remained dormant for a period of time until something triggers this episode of shingles to happen. So normally what happens is it happens along a single dermatome, and it produces these very painful plaques. So if you kind of looked back to to that nerve chart, if we scroll back just for a second, so it would happen along a single one of these paths. Normally you can see where there's like this whole pathway along one of these very painful plaques that happen. So you can see right there, that's where one would happen. They're very red and very painful, and that happens right along one of those dermatome paths. So we're just going to talk a little bit about some of the different divisions of the peripheral nervous system. So one of them is the autonomic nervous system, and that's the motor neurons that conduct impulses from your central nervous system to things like your cardiac muscle and your smooth muscle and your glandular tissue, and those regulate your body's, like, those automatic responses. That's why it's an autonomic nervous system. So those are your involuntary functions. And your autonomic effectors are the tissues in which they conduct the impulses. So it would be like your cardiac or smooth muscle or the glandular tissue that it affects. And so your autonomic nervous system is also divided into two separate sections. You have your parasympathetic and then your sympathetic nervous system. So one of these are pretty important because these have to do with your fight or flight or your relaxation. So your sympathetic nervous system, this is your fight or flight response. So if you get super stressed and you get that, like, oh my God, I'm being attacked from a bear, I need to run away feeling, it's your sympathetic nervous system that's being triggered. So it's going to start dilating your bronchioles. It's going to expand your lungs to take in as much oxygen as you can. It speeds up your heart rate. It secretes adrenaline, which is telling your body to, like, run for your life. It's going to decrease all the motility here in your GI system because now it's focusing on the fight or flight. So all it's really thinking about is adrenaline to make you go, speeding up your heart rate, speeding up your respiratory rate. It just wants you to run. Or your parasympathetic, this is your rest and relaxation. So here your heartbeat's slowing down, you're increasing some GI motility. So these two oppose each other. But your sympathetic one is your fight or flight response. So kind of like we said here, just another review. So your sympathetic nervous system, this is your emergency or stress system. So when you feel angry or you feel anxiety or fear, any strong emotion, this is the one that gets triggered. And it just triggers that fight or flight response. How am I going to run away and protect myself? Your parasympathetic one, this is the one that's going to control most of those normal, everyday, relaxed functions. So your autonomic system as a whole is going to regulate the body's automatic functions in ways that maintain or quickly restore homeostasis. Because remember, all of your body systems are just working to maintain homeostasis because that's what's going to help you survive and keep you alive and healthy. So the main visceral effects are integral. So they receive messages from both your parasympathetic and your sympathetic divisions, and they oppose each other to kind of balance each other out and maintain homeostasis. So some disorders of your autonomic nervous system, there can be some stress-induced problems, and that's where prolonged or excessive stress actually triggers your sympathetic nervous system to the point where it disrupts a lot of the normal functioning in your body. Some examples of this are conditions which include things like an increased risk of heart disease or digestive problems, a lot of like constipation issues, or reduced resistance to disease because your body is so busy being concerned with like running away from whatever you're afraid of that it doesn't take care of those normal functions anymore. And then another one that you can have is a neuroblastoma, which is a highly malignant tumor that triggers your sympathetic nervous system. And most of the time, this affects young children, so you see it when you're young. And I believe that brings us to the end of the nervous system. So good job, you made it through one more.